Hi there and welcome to our live stream marking the news that the United States and Iran have agreed to a peace deal that immediately halts all military operations, including in Lebanon. The announcement was made by Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif. Here's what he had to say on X. Following intensive talks, we are pleased to announce that the peace deal between the United States of America and Islamic Republic of Iran has been reached. Both sides have declared the immediate and permanent termination of military operations on all fronts, including in Lebanon. The official signing ceremony will be on Friday, 19th of June in Switzerland. Now, Shehbaz Sharif's post was followed by US President Donald Trump confirming the deal on Truth Social. The deal with the Islamic Republic of Iran is now complete. Congratulations to all. I hereby fully authorise the toll-free opening of the Strait of Hormuz and simultaneously herewith authorise the immediate removal of the United States naval blockade. Ships of the world, start your engines. Let the oil flow. President Donald J. Trump. In Iran, state television confirmed the deal had been reached, claiming that Iran, had forced the United States into a deal. So that's what we have from the major players in the deal at this point. We're now going to be joined by our Washington correspondent, Benjamin Alvarez-Gruber. Good to see you, Ben. So a deal has been reached, according to Pakistan. What is the US government saying at this point?
So what we've been hearing from President Trump over the last couple of days is that the war is over. That's something that he repeated, not only him, but also high-ranking members of the administration, that this was really close. It wasn't clear if there would actually be this announcement by the Pakistani Prime Minister, a country that has been taking the role of a mediator, talking to the Iranians, talking to the US. To only a couple of hours ago, President Trump said that a peace deal was close, warning the parties, and I quote, to not blow it. We've heard from US media, from a journalist who works for Axios, who spoke to President Trump earlier today, who voiced strong criticism on the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for those latest strikes on Lebanon. So now we have this announcement. Shortly after we heard from the Pakistani Prime Minister, we heard that tweet that you just read out, and then also the confirmation from the Iranian side that a deal had been reached, that there will still be some meetings where they will talk about the details, exactly how that will look like. But this announcement by President Trump to lift this naval blockade on the Strait of Hormuz, telling them that now they can start moving freely. And of course, the date that was announced by the Pakistani Prime Minister of the signing ceremony next Friday, June 19th, in Switzerland, after this G7 summit where President Trump is also expected to attend.
Yeah, so as to what we know and what we don't know, we need to be honest. We've heard from Pakistan, who have been playing the position of moderator in this deal. We've heard from Trump on Truth Social. Do we know much more of the fine detail, Ben, at this point?
We're still waiting on this fine details. There have been a lot of rumors, and of course every side is using this to portray a deal more favorable to them. The US side has been doing that, the Iranian side has been doing it. We know what the key points are, where there were still some difficulties that should be reached. One of them is, of course, the Iranian nuclear program. The other one are the sanctions that the US is then being talked out to lift those sanctions. What we've heard from an Iranian official that spoke to US media, he said that this would actually be the termination of the Iranian nuclear program, but we still need to wait to find more about the details, what was actually announced today. And it took quite a couple of minutes until we heard from the Iranian side after the Pakistani Prime Minister and the US President spoke about this. So probably in the next couple of days we hear more about the details of this agreement that will be signed next Friday in Switzerland.
So a big day for Trump as well. Is this going to be seen as a big win for Trump on his birthday, Ben, or just the minimum of what he was aiming for?
I think what we have learned is that announcing an agreement and then getting the details could be two different things. There's a lot of domestic pressure on President Trump, also by his supporters, to end the war. He promised over and over before returning to the White House that there would be no more endless American wars. With this war in Iran, many of his supporters also voiced strong criticism, saying that this was not needed, that there was a free flow of ships on the Strait of Hormuz, a very important strait, of course, for the global economy. So there's been a lot of criticism there. But as you just mentioned, it's a very symbolic day to announce this. Here behind me, you can see this UFC claw. There will be some boxing happening here. And it's President Trump's 80th birthday. So for someone who wants to portray himself as a deal maker, who is trying to get peace, it will be big for him to be able to announce it. Maybe he will speak on the South Lawn, where this huge structure has been built over the last couple of days, also saying that the deal has finally been reached. But if it will be enough for his supporters until they see the prices actually going down, we've spoken to many of them over the last couple of weeks, many saying that it should not have gone this far by the U.S. to launch this military strikes on Iran that also led to this huge increase in prices. But for the White House, it is a win for now. The question is whether he will be able to convince his supporters that the deal is favorable to the United States, and then it was necessary to launch this military action that led then to the war with Iran that might be coming to an end soon.
Yeah, it's very early in this news cycle, Ben, as the world is digesting and slowly reacting to news of the deal. Sans a lot of the fine detail, as we've discussed, what we don't know. Do you have a sense at all, and you alluded to a little bit of it there, of how the news has landed there in Washington?
So, of course, from his base, from the MAGA base, and also from several members close to the administration, a lot of celebration, a lot of anticipation to this deal. I'd say with those who are not so close to the administration, there's still a lot of skepticism because pressure was so strong on the U.S. president, on the White House, to be able to deliver something, to deliver some results. It wasn't clear if this would work out. Only a couple of hours ago, as I mentioned, he said that the parties involved in this war should not blow it up. And that, of course, contradicts completely the position that he has been saying over and over, that the White House, the Trump administration has been saying that the U.S. is in control of the Strait of Hormuz, that Iran has been obliterated, with these attacks still occurring after these Israeli attacks on Lebanon, on alleged Hezbollah positions. Iran vowed to retaliate. This is not something that we have seen yet, and there might be something closer to a ceasefire now. But I think even his strongest supporters, who said that this was necessary, wanted to kind of see some sort of deal without knowing what is happening on the balance, what is happening with these conversations. But it is something that would have weighed heavily over the G7 meeting that is happening next week. President Trump, shortly after this UFC fighting on the White House South Lawn, will depart to Geneva to attend this G7 summit. And if he wanted to arrive there with some positive news, it was not possible when he went to China, when he met with the Chinese President Xi Jinping, of course, according to many experts, losing this leverage that the U.S. could have on China on several other issues. So for Trump, it is good news to be able to come to this G7 leaders summit in Geneva with some positive news. And I'm sure many of the European allies will ask him behind closed doors what are the details of this deal and when they could actually be seeing some sort of normalization and maybe even an agreement on the Iranian nuclear program in the future.
Right, you've done a great job in a really short amount of time, Ben. I want to ask one more before we go, and it's probably an unfair one as well. Is it too early to ask, Benjamin, if we take it that this conflict is indeed over, what effect has this conflict had and his handling, Trump that is, on his second presidency and his legacy?
There were many of his supporters that drew a red line there. They said one of the main campaign promises of President Trump was one, lowering prices, inflation, the other one, ending America's endless war. Launching these attacks, getting the U.S. dragged into this conflict with Iran that also affected several of the key partners of the United States in the region. On these attacks on several of U.S. allies led also to an increase of prices. So we have both of them. We spoke to some supporters who said we support President Trump on a lot of things that he has done, on migration, on the southern border. But when it comes to Iran, they don't understand why this military option was necessary, why it was still necessary to keep pushing to find kind of a deal that was already in place. We remember the agreement that was signed under the presidency of Barack Obama, with several European members also involved. It wasn't quite clear what the end game was for the United States. If it was just regime change that has not been sorted out, what the US wanted to reach, how it wanted to pressure the regime in Tehran. So for now, they are probably wondering what this deal will be about, if there were any concessions, any strong concessions from the United States relating to Iran. What was the Iranian position there, the role that Israel played also with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, who, according to this conversation that President Trump had with a reporter here in the U.S., with Trump not being really pleased with these latest Israeli attacks on Lebanon. So it remains to be seen what are the details, if there were any concessions from the US, what will come out of it. But first of all, we need to hear about the details, what was announced by the Pakistani Prime Minister, and we will probably hear that from the US President, and maybe even tonight when he will appear on this UFC fighting arena, fighting cage that has been built on the White House Southland. So there's definitely a lot of expectations for that too.
Yeah, from a peace deal, we pivot to a cage match at the White House. These are unique days. DW's Benjamin Alvarez-Gruber in Washington. We'll leave it there for now. Thank you very much as we turn to our next guest, move straight on and talk to an expert as we try and put this news into some context. Sama Shahata, some questions on this matter. Great to have you with us, Sama, Professor of Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma, joining us from Arlington in Virginia. Welcome. Trump has been saying a deal is close for more than a week now, after hearing that for a long time we were so close. Was there an element of surprise when you heard that we had indeed finally got here?
Well, for the last 24 hours or so, there has been talk and reporting of an imminent deal. And it did seem that this time, more than previous times, that this could materialize. We saw the Qataris involved at the last minute to try to salvage the possibility of a deal after the Israeli strikes on Beirut and so on. And so I think that, yes, it wasn't a complete surprise. And certainly it's very good news for Iran, for the United States, for the Arab Gulf states, for the wider region, and so on.
Yeah, Sama, what do you think was going to be the most difficult thing, the difficult point to resolve in getting to this deal? You talk about Qatar coming in late. I guess we should add that the details we are most interested in to know, we need to know those details. What was the most important point, the most difficult hurdle they had to get over to get to here where we are now?
Well, I think in all honesty, the most difficult thing was to somehow restrain Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israelis from continually trying to sabotage what clearly the Iranians and President Trump wanted, which was an end to hostilities, so that, there would be no more bombing of Iran, so that Iranian trade could commence, that their ports wouldn't be blockaded, so that the price of gasoline would go down in the United States and the stock market wouldn't suffer as it had, and so on. And obviously an end to the violence. And so Prime Minister Netanyahu's attacks on Beirut earlier today and previously and so on, I think has been the major obstacle. However, I do think it needs to be said that although one should be positive about the deal and the end of hostilities, many of the major issues, as your colleague previously mentioned, about Iran's nuclear program, about Iran's ballistic missiles, about the groups that Iran supports in the wider region and so on. None of those have been solved. Iran's nuclear material, and so really, it's great that what has been achieved is an end to hostilities and the opening of the Straits of Hormuz and the unblocking of Iranian ports. But the question needs to be asked, what has the United States and Israel really achieved after 3 months of war, devastation, incredible cost across the board, including to the United States and to Lebanese civilians and Iranians from this conflict? And I think the answer is not very much, unfortunately.
Yeah, so let's, on what has been achieved, let's pull on that thread via the Strait of Hormuz, Sama. We'd like to take a look, if we can, at a live graphic of the shipping traffic in the body of water that we all know so much better than we did 105 days ago. Around 20% of the world's oil travels through here, but almost nothing has got through this very narrow and shallow body of water for the past 3.5 months. Now Trump says the US blockade has been lifted and shipping will pass toll-free. Importantly, though, Sama, Iran is saying through Iran's Fars news agency that Iran and Oman will regulate the flow of traffic. If that is true, Sama, to your point, who can claim to have won any sort of victory here?
Well, I think your point is correct, and both sides, and this shouldn't be surprising, will claim victory. President Trump will claim victory for opening the Straits of Hormuz and doing damage to Iran's military capabilities and so on. And Iran will certainly, and quite rightly to some extent, claim victory for not having regime collapse, which was one of the original goals of the Israeli and American attack on February the 28th, from withstanding, the most powerful country in the world and probably the most powerful military in the region, Israel, and for doing really significant damage to American military forces in the region. Every single American military base in the Gulf has been successfully attacked by Iran, doing billions of dollars of damage. So both sides will claim victory. There's a narrative war, of course, going on. As your previous colleague mentioned, this is President Trump's birthday. He's going to claim that, he achieved this on his birthday. The Iranians, however, in Tehran, it is tomorrow. It is June 15th. And they intentionally, it seemed, waited until the evening in the United States to announce that their agreement to this, so that it wasn't on President Trump's birthday. So there's also a narrative war. And regardless of what the outcome would have been, both sides would have claimed success.
What did this conflict, now that we have a peace deal in hand, what did the conflict tell us and tell you about the relationship between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, the US and Israel?
Well, I think it showed that, like the previous administration, that is the Biden administration, the Trump administration was not completely willing to use the leverage that the United States has to restrain, Prime Minister Netanyahu's belligerence at times. It's for the last several years, whether it's in Gaza or in Lebanon or in Iran. But I think it also told us something else, which is there has been a tremendous amount of reporting here in the United States about the lead up to the war, with excellent accounts with insider interviews by the New York Times about Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to the White House before February 28th, seemingly convincing President Trump to begin this war. And as your colleague mentioned, President Trump won an election in part on the mantra of no more endless wars and so on. So I think it does show us, it is really highlighted the peculiar relationship between the United States and Israel, in which you supposedly have the most powerful country in the world, the United States, and you supposedly have a small, client state of the United States. And it's not really clear sometimes who calls the shots or who is moving foreign policy.
Let's turn that coin over then and talk about the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah. That was that vicious circle going around right up until this deal was announced, even the morning thereof, Iran saying that the US had to hold Israel responsible. what did you learn? What did we learn about the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah?
Well, that's also fascinating because what we saw most recently as a result of the attacks last week and the fighting between Israel and Hezbollah is we saw Iran respond. And so Iran was laying claim to the idea that this treaty, this memorandum of understanding and the end of the war will have to include, hopefully, a cessation of violence between Hezbollah and Israel. And that has not always been the case. Hezbollah has been thought of in the past as being a card that Iran can play with regard to Israel. But here, what we've seen in the last week or so is Iran willing to engage in hostilities, that is, attacks on Israel and American bases as a result of Israeli attacks on Lebanon. We've also learned, I think, that, and this is a more general point, that these forces are stronger than maybe what the United States and Israel first thought. I mean, at the beginning, there was talk about regime change in Tehran, the 2004 war, and the tremendous success that Israel had against Hezbollah, whether it was taking out Hassan Nasrallah, the head, and many of the other leaders of Hezbollah, or the pager attack and so on. But Hezbollah is still a force in Lebanon, and you cannot eradicate it, and you cannot achieve political goals or security by military means. And I think everyone needs to realize that. President Trump, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the Iranians.
Yeah, that was good. We're going to break down the rest of the chat with you as to what we know, what we've learned, and what we don't know yet, some of the details, I guess. So I'll get to those with you in a moment. But as for what we've learned, we heard a lot, Sama, that the advice from inside the White House, from the people with great experience and knowledge of what has come in the past, was essentially don't go, don't do it. What do you think the advice will be to very near future presidencies and administrations when it comes to dealing with Iran?
Well, that's a very good point. And let's hope that this is a lesson for future administrations, that it is really close to impossible. And this is a lesson that should have been learned earlier as a result of the U.S. engagement with Afghanistan, the longest war in American history, or the U.S. engagement with Iraq, the 2003 war, and so on. That it seems much easier to achieve political gains or goals through military means than it actually is. And that's also something that the United States has been continually learning. I mean, that was one of the lessons of the Vietnam War and so on, that you cannot solve these seemingly intractable political problems through, military force, even if the United States continues to have the most powerful military in the world. That in itself will not produce the kind of outcomes that you want. And hopefully that's a lesson that future presidents will take to heart.
Yeah, and there's so many headline takeaway here, I guess, one of them being the most powerful military in the world up against an enemy who are engaging in hybrid warfare on a very cheap basis, like the cost of the weapons involved, and that this force, under so much pressure from those type of weapons, was able to hold off the strongest military in the world. It has to change the way that the US deals with it and thinks about its own defence and attack going forward, surely you would think.
Oh, there's no question about that. And also, I think, your point about Iran's strategy with regard to the war and so on, how other parties became involved without their willingness to do so. I mean, the entire Arab Gulf, whether it was Kuwait or Bahrain or Qatar or the UAE, which was attacked significantly, their economies, their importance in global trade and transportation, all of that was impacted by this war. And so it's not simply a military, there's not only a military dimension to this, there's not also only a regional dimension to this. The whole global economy with regard to oil prices and energy prices and natural gas prices in Europe, and particularly East Asia and so on, were affected much more than in the United States. And of course, Americans have been complaining over the last months about the increase in gas prices and so on. So yes, this is not simply a regional matter. It wasn't simply the US, Israel against Iran and so on. The wider region was impacted, and the entire global political economy was impacted negatively, unfortunately.
All right, two more questions before we move on. Of the details that we don't yet know, what are you most looking forward to finding out? What do we not know yet that is most crucial to this peace deal holding?
Well, I think that the big issues, of course, are going to be addressed, hopefully, during this 60-day period of ceasefire and beyond. And it's not clear that they can be resolved in that short of a time. And they are, of course, the future of Iran's nuclear program and the nuclear dust, as the fissile material, as President Trump likes to refer to it. So what will be the status of that? Will there be an inspections regime? Will the nuclear material be diluted, or will it be transported out of Iran, as has been suggested, either to Russia or some other place? Iran's ballistic missile capability, I mean, as we've seen, and as you mentioned, some of the unexpected consequences of this, Iran's ballistic missiles were quite effective despite the air defense systems and so on there. And so the ballistic missiles will be a very important point for the Gulf states and for Israel. Of course, the question of sanctions relief is that's a $50 billion question in terms of Iran's frozen funds overseas and the functioning of Iran's economy going forward. Not to mention Iran's relationship with what have been called, I don't like this term, but the proxy groups that Iran supports, whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hamas in Palestine or Ansar Allah, sometimes known as the Houthis in Yemen, and other groups in Iraq. What is the relationship? What will the relationship be? Will there be any attempt to control that or to limit that in terms of weapons or training and so on? So those are all, very complicated questions that I hope the likes of Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, individuals who do not have a history or experience in diplomacy and so on, and have a very poor track record, unfortunately, can resolve in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, so knowing the people who have got the reins here, one more, Sama, before we go, is that with all of your decades of really distinguished study in this field of what we know so far, how confident are you that what we have will hold?
I think it'll hold between the United States and Iran. I'm fairly confident of that because, of course, as I mentioned, President Trump and the Iranian regime now, even the hardliners who have come to power, right, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is another outcome of this war and so on, they do not want to engage in a renewed round of hostility. So I think that will hold. The question that I think is worrisome is the Israel-Lebanon question. Israel-Hezbollah question. Will Prime Minister Netanyahu and the far-right government in Israel continue maybe less frequent, but nevertheless attacks on Lebanon and so on? And then how could that scuttle somehow this wider agreement? Would that then produce Iranian response and so on? And then we'd be almost back to square one. So that's something that I'm very much concerned about. And of course, obviously, the continuing Israeli presence in Lebanon, 9, 10 miles, hundreds of acres and so on of Israeli control of southern Lebanon, even past the Litani River, that is not a recipe for stability and so on. So there are a number of factors, I think, that still will have to be worked out before we can fully sigh relief.
Sama Shahada, it's been absolutely fascinating to listen to you just in the minutes and coming up to an hour since the deal was announced. Professor of Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. It's been an absolute pleasure to tap into your experience on this matter. Thanks for jumping on the line. We really appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure. Nice speaking with you.
And with that, many thanks. We will end it there. Thanks to Sama and thanks to Benjamin Alvarez-Gruber, of course. Thanks for tuning in as we went through everything we know about this US-Iran peace deal that has just been announced. Feel free to leave us a comment and tell us what you think about the deal and if it might actually bring an end to the violence in the region. I'm Anthony Howard from me and all the crew here in Berlin. We'll see you next time.